Welcome to the book of Daniel. Okay, the second session tonight, Kings, Queens, and Treachery. Let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, Lord, as we approach your word tonight, again, we ask that you will give us wisdom, give us understanding, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. In this session, we're going to take on Daniel 11. And let me tell you some things right up front. First of all, you cannot cover this in one session. There's no way we can do justice to this in one setting. And you're going to have some material to take home, and we'll give you some more on Thursday to take home. And Daniel 11, since it comes to the unfulfilled portion of prophecy, necessarily will have some things that we can't define 100%. So let's make that clear up front. Now, there can be legitimate differences of opinion about some of the characters that we're going to look at, as long as we are working from the historical position. We're not given exact names, we're given descriptions. And some descriptions people can look like other people in the same description to different people. But in faithfulness to the historical method and the belief that Daniel really was written when it says it was written will help us interpret some of the things that we come across and help with some of the issues that we may have. Probably if we were to sit down with everybody here and we would talk about this, we get past a certain point, we would probably have different opinions on what some of it was. But they would all be based, I would hope, on the historical method of interpretation. Now, if you're using the historical method and you say, this is what I see, and you give me evidence, I'm going to say, well, you may be right. If you're not using the historical method, I'm going to say you're wrong. Unless you just happen to stumble into something that's right. So I've read several authors I trust, and there's not an exact agreement on the last few verses of Daniel 11. But again, they all use the historical method, which is sound, and the general theme is as clear as a bell. And third, and this is the most important for us to understand tonight, I think, is there comes a point when Daniel 11 is unfulfilled prophecy. Not be the last verse of 11 and between that and verse 12, but we're not to verse 12 yet because we have not experienced the second coming. So we know that all of Daniel 11 hasn't been fulfilled yet. We know that it is near, and as we look at it, we can expect to understand more. And then fourth, as always, there is some of Daniel that becomes a lot clearer when we combine it with passages of some revelation. Oh, great. As a matter of fact, we can say that about much, if not most, of Daniel. And then this is important to keep in mind. Jesus gave us these words. Now, I have told you before it comes to pass that, what? Read it with me. When it is come to pass, you might believe. Sometimes I listen to people talking about prophecy, particularly unfulfilled prophecy, and they seem to do it in a very prideful manner. I'm right and you're wrong. And when you have that idea when you're going into it, you're wrong no matter whether you're right or not. But Jesus said that the prophecy was given not so that we can be great predictors, but so that we can recognize the events when they're taking place. And I think we see many of the events going on right now. If we watch the world around us, we can see many events happening that show us that we are right at the, as somebody said, in the toenails of the image. So we know that we're right down there at the end. So having said that, let's take off. Daniel 11 is a literal explanation of prophecy by the angel that was interacting with Daniel. And we understand that Daniel 10 runs seamlessly into Daniel 11. and Daniel 11 runs seamlessly into Daniel 12. They're part of the same narrative. And if there's any division, this probably comes about Daniel 12, verse 4 or 5, where we have sort of a recap of some of the other things that have gone on. So Daniel 11 is being narrated by the great angel. And we begin with verse 10. And let's open our Bibles, or we have the first verse up here. In the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar, and the thing was true, but the time appointed was what? Long. Now, for Daniel, 70 years weren't that long. Daniel's probably 80 years old now. I mean, it was a long time, but not long like 490 years or 2,300 years. The time appointed was long, and he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. So we have a switch here. Daniel's finally catching on to everything. He's finally getting it, so he understands how this is one place, and this is another place, and this is another place. And he may have been confused when he was thinking about the 70-year prophecy of Jeremiah, but things were coming together. And it says the vision was long, and then he understood the thing. We can date the time of these three chapters to the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, which is in the spring of 536 BC. Now there are some clues as to the particular day that the appearance of God came unto Daniel, and I found this fascinating. Daniel records that he had been mourning and fasting for 3 full weeks. And then God appeared to him on the 24th day of the first month. And we find that in Daniel 10:4. And the implication is that the 24th day of the first month took place immediately after the end of 3 weeks of fasting. Now the original language indicates 3 full weeks. So since this vision appeared to Daniel at the end of 3 full weekdays, it probably came to him on a Sabbath day. Now it's interesting, we have a rather direct parallel with Revelation where John receives his vision on the Lord's day. And that is not interpreted this Sunday. The Lord is the Lord of the Sabbath, so the Sabbath is the Lord's day. And you'll probably remember Jesus in Mark 2:28 said he was the Lord of the Sabbath. So Daniel and John, both elderly, both of them in exile, both given apocalyptic prophecy, both given a vision of God, and these were given a blessing on the Sabbath day. Fascinating, isn't it? So this prophecy begins, as we said before, in the third year of Cyrus. Babylon is gone. It is off the scene. Persia is ruling now. The Greeks are knocking at the door, so to speak. And we read in Daniel 11, and just go ahead and open your Bibles here. Daniel 11, verses 2 through 4. Now I will give you next week a copy. I may have it here with me, but I don't think so. An outline of the characters mentioned in here, but some of them we can figure out pretty easily. Let's look at verses 2 through 4. And behold, I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than them all. By his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. And then a mighty king shall rise, who shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion, with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for the others beside him. Now, from what we have studied, what do we have so far? The explanation begins with Persia. Persia is off the scene real quick, okay? Doesn't spend much time with Persia. What do we have next? We have Alexander the Great, right? Because we have a mighty ruler, the kingdom broken and divided into 4 parts, and his own posterity does not take the kingdom. Alexander the Great did have a baby son when he died, but he did not leave the kingdom to his son. He left the kingdom to his generals, and if you remember, he was asked who should have it, and he said to the one with the most power, which created a tremendous power struggle. Now, here's probably a good place to interject this, and I think that it's important as we look here and in other places in the Bible. And that's the concept of the king of the south and the king of the north. And they were based on the relationship to Israel. And you'll see here in this graph where Israel is, almost a tiny dot in the middle of everything else. The king of the south, obviously, Egypt. And then the king of the north would be whatever power came from the north to conquer Israel, which was the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Because they, more than likely, most of them did not use ships. The Romans did somewhat. Most of them went by land, so anybody coming to conquer Israel would come down through the north, following the coast along where the land was more pleasant. They did not like to go across the desert. Nebuchadnezzar did a forced march across the desert, but that was just to save his kingdom. And I'm talking like across the desert this way. And so we find that the king of the north and the king of the south begins to move from a literal explanation to a spiritual explanation, as we will see coming up later. So, Babylon was the original king of the north. And let's see if this will work. It won't work there. Okay, you see, Babylon was down here, what we call Iraq. When they took their armies, they would follow the river. You can see the river Euphrates there going all the way up into the mountains. They would follow that, and they would come down the coastline. That way they would have food, water for themselves and their animals, and so forth and so on. So that's the way that they traveled. Now the literal part of this first part of this chapter describes the king of the north, but it doesn't use that per se, but it's describing the king of the north and the way they work. As we get to the end of this chapter, we find that it becomes more of a spiritual application, but it is also still a physical application with spiritual implications. Does that make sense? Now, this is the literal part in the first part of this chapter, but we find out that God's true Israel, who is not the nation Israel, but God's true Israel, is the one who is experiencing the conflict from the north and from the south. So, the king of the north was any power from the north which harassed God's people, but the religious component increases as the chapter moves along, and the king of the north becomes not only a national entity, but a spiritual entity, which sounds a whole lot like the little horn power, does it not? So the spiritual king of the north is such because of its relationship to or against God's faithful people. Does that make sense? The spiritual king of the north becomes a power that stands against God's people, just like the spiritual king of the south also becomes a power that stands against God's people. Now, at the time Daniel was written, the king of the north was first Babylon and then Persia. Now, Persia didn't conquer Israel, really. They just kind of took over what Babylon had left, and they were actually quite beneficial to Israel. But we find that still, during the time of Cambyses, when the building of this temple was started, the king of the north still was the Persian Empire because they were controlling at that time. And that happened to benefit or deficit at one time or the other. So the king of the north and the south reappear when we get down to verse 40. But we're not to verse 40 yet, so just kind of put a pin in that. Like I said, I'm going to give you a handout Thursday that identifies the players along the way. Since I'm most concerned with what happens with Jesus, I would like us to jump to verse 20. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And if we go on and read verses 21 and 22, 11, 21, and 22, we see, in his place shall rise a vile person to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peacefully and seek the kingdom by intrigue. And by verse 20, by the way, speaks of Augustus Caesar, who was the first Roman emperor. And by the way, he was the one who ordered the census that was taking place when Jesus was born. And the census wasn't to number the people, it was to collect the taxes. Find out how many people you have so you know how much taxes have to be raised. Now, verse 22, we have a vile person coming in peacefully and seizing the kingdom by intrigue. And we find out that through divorce and remarriage and killings, Tiberius became the next Caesar. And it was during this rule that Jesus was crucified. And we read in verse 22, with the force of a flood they shall sweep away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. So actually the prince of the covenant is broken in the time of Caesar, Tiberius Caesar. And the Romans' rule continued to persecute Christians and Jews, and we see that in many ways as we go through this. And then the change from pagan Rome to papal Rome did not change the situation. And we find that some variant of that situation will continue until Jesus returns. Now, obviously, we're having to skip a lot of history here. But I want to move on to verse 32. Verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupted by flatteries, but the people that do not know their God shall be strong. Let me back up and read that again. Yes. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupted by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And we come to a time in religious history where religious positions were bought and sold by unsanctified men. As a matter of fact, they would buy a bishopric, and the bishop may be as young as 13 years old, and it was just a matter of money, because the bishops, once they paid for that power, then they could recoup their money with taxes and indulgences and so forth and so on as they ruled, and I say rule in a negative word, their people. And the rulers were exalted or brought down based on their relationship with Rome. And kings had to be approved by the papacy, or they would not be allowed to rule. People may say, okay, we want such and such a king. Mr. Pope, can we have this king? I mean, basically that's the way it went. And we also know that during this time it was a crime to have a Bible, punishable by death. And this time the lovers of God were hunted down like game. Many were slaughtered or imprisoned. Estimates of those who lost their lives for their faith during the Dark Ages run into the millions of people. At this same time, the verse that we just looked at described a people who know their God and who are strong and do great exploits. And those were people who kept a pure religion alive during the Dark Ages. And this is the description of the faithful few during the Dark Ages. And then we have the Reformation beginning. And let's move now to verse 36, jumping forward again, which I believe gives us the beginning of a description of the French Revolution. Verse 36. The king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till wrath has been accomplished, for what has been determined shall be done. Sounds like a little horn power, but it is not. We can pinpoint the text near the end of that 2,300 days. The 1,260 years are just about finished. What happens then? We know from history that the Pope was taken captive by the French during the French Revolution, using a pretext of one of the Frenchmen being harmed in the city of Rome. Napoleon sent his General Berthier in and gave the Pope a little invitation to come live in France for a while. And so they took the Pope to France, and he died there within a year, and then the French elected a pope that was suitable to them, but they kept him in France at that time. So we find this is a dark period for the papacy. But God's enemy works to destroy truth, whether by falsehood or atheism. It doesn't make any difference. And you may be familiar with this picture. This is one of the halls in Versailles, France. The French Revolution was essentially an extreme reaction to a church that had become extremely unchurch-like. The church and state had been so intertwined as to all be working for one purpose. They were corrupt, they were greedy, They were self-serving. They had killed and they had persecuted from France the citizens with the most education and faith and almost all the merchant class because they were Protestants. And at the same time, there was conflict with the Pope. So at Versailles, the so-called royalty of the nation were partied and entertained and frequently coerced to give total loyalty to the king, who in turn demanded total loyalty to the church, as long as the church agreed with him. And the whole purpose of Versailles was to collect everybody that had any power in one place so the king could keep his fingers on everything. And by the way, that also included the leaders of the church. During this time, we find that the common man was taxed and overworked to the point of breaking, and this cartoon pretty much says it all. So you have the peasant there with his staff, and he's carrying the burden of the nobility in the fancy hat, and the priestly class, as shown by the, I guess, cardinal there that's red without a hat. And that's pretty much what was going on in France. It was just a really bad situation. And it came to the point where it was so bad that the only thing the people could see to do was to overthrow all of it, the royalty and the church. So heresy has within itself always its own downfall. And because of the incestuous relationship between church and state, a change in the monarchy required a change in the church also. Now, since the church had basically destroyed Protestantism in France, there was not that option to go to. So when the monarchy was overthrown in the French Revolution, the church went out with it. The option that France took was establishing the worship of no religion. In other words, the worship of man. We hear the term humanism now, and basically that goes back to the French Revolution. Reason was their God. They worshiped themselves. Reason was represented by a more or less moral actress, and mankind was the God that was worshipped. Now, all this was a result of a supposedly ex-Jesuit named Adam Weishaupt. And a year before, he formed the Illuminati, and I can remember when I was a kid, people said that was not such a thing, but now they seem to be proud of it. John Robertson wrote a book about Weishaupt entitled Proof of a Conspiracy Against the Religions and Governments of Europe. The title pretty much says it all. Yeah, it pretty much says it all. And so here are the aims of the Illuminati, what they were and they still are. The abolition of all ordered government. See if we see this playing out in our nation today. Abolition of all monarchy, or authority we might say. Abolition of all private property and inheritance. Abolition of all patriotism. Abolition of the family with children as wards of the state. Abolition of all religion.
What did they not accomplish?
They're pretty much, yes, they have pretty much managed to do most of that in our country. And a lot of people don't realize the God that they're actually following.
And that list is in your handout, right?
Pardon?
That list that you just read is
It's in the notes. Okay. In 1798, following these principles under the revolution of Robespierre, without the restraint of religion, France went into it literally went mad. The slaughter was terrible. It was so bad that one of the revolutionaries, Dr. Guillotine, developed what he hoped would be a kinder, gentler, and faster way of killing, the guillotine. And the blood continued to flow. And by the way, he experienced his end on the guillotine also. The churches were desecrated, shut down. Reason was elevated above faith. Marriage was degraded to a temporary contract. And I'm reading a book now about marriage in France during that period of time, and it's really fascinating. There were actually some good reforms that came out of that, but most of them were negative. Most priests abandoned their faith. A 10-day week was instituted. The effort was to eradicate all concept of a Bible from people's minds. And if you have a 7-day week, where does the 7-day week come from? It's rooted in the Bible. There's no other reason for a 7-day week other than God created. The metric system came out of the French Revolution. I know we abhor that, even if it is easier to deal with the decimal system than the odd system that we have. Well, technically, we're on the metric system. You do that, by the way. We're officially on the metric system as a country, but we still are not totally on it, which makes for confusion. Bibles are burned and desecrated, and it was declared that religion is dead. Long live reason. And then Napoleon comes on the scene. You've heard about Napoleon, a very strong little man. He recognized that the nation was going to self-destruct without moral limits. At his instruction, the worst excesses of the revolution were set aside, religion was reestablished, things were improved in society. However, this was not the desire to establish religion as a theologically correct something or the other. It was just a method of trying to hold the nation together and give the society structure. And then, of course, we remember that Napoleon gave the Pope a little visit and asked him to stay in France a while. The Pope was brought to Avignon, and he died there. Revolution was not really dead. The revolution has not really died. To this point, there are still some parts of it out there. Out of this came new ideas of financial structure for nations. Out of this turmoil came what was known today as Marxism or communism, which is nothing but an atheistic belief, religious belief in oneself. From the ideas of the struggles of the masses came a new expression of communism, and the theory of the survival of the fittest blossomed. And this was put into practical application in the biological world by the teachings of Charles Darwin. Darwinism was the perfect biological explanation for the parallel Marxist theory on how man could make himself better and better by his own efforts until social utopia could be reached. And if you think that Illuminism has passed, just look at the speed with which its principles are being instituted by our world right now and our government in our country. So now, we are past the 1260-year prophecy, and we are approaching the end of the 2300-year prophecy. So you can see that in our chart. I'm sorry, this one is so messed up. 1798 and then 1844. And we will talk about that judgment a little more later. Now, I want to deal now with trends rather than specifics. While Christ is adding to his ministry in the heavenly sanctuary after the 2300 days, the events on earth are moving along. And while not obvious to most while they were taking place, looking back, we can see a pattern emerging. The intensity of spiritual warfare is increasing year by year as Satan is trying to take over the world for his side, and God at the same time is trying to spread his influence out in the world. So I want to take a look at some of the events within 50 years of the French Revolution. Things that might not be notable by themselves, but when viewed together are a trend that is very telling. Of course, the revolution itself and the excesses that we just described before, the roots of Marxism and communism, the militant atheism increasing, the development of non-sustainable financial theories to run, and I put in parentheses, ruin nations, the voyage of the Beagle and the work of Charles Darwin, whose book was published in 1844, the denigration of marriage as a result of the French Revolution, spiritualism taking root in the United States, the papacy taken captive for a while and then in submission to the emperor. And then we have the establishment of the United States and have the Bible societies being formed and missionaries sent out, Livingstone, Carey, Moravians, and others. And by the way, if you can do some reading on the Moravians, I would really encourage you to seek that out. The Moravians they would sell themselves into slavery so that they could be missionaries to the slaves. They literally did that in the Caribbean. And amazing. Livingstone, known today as a great explorer, his whole purpose was to take the gospel to Africa. He did exploring on the side. And when he died, I guess you know this, the Africans said, you can take his body, but our heart stays right here. And so there's a marker where his heart's buried in Africa. Yes. So, and you have Mary Baker Eddy. The Mormons, you have the Millerite and the Seventh-day Adventist movement. You have the opening of China and Japan to the West, a tremendous factor in world history. And then you have the Turks, and how a prophecy and revelation pinpointed the exact day that the Ottoman Empire would fall from greatness. And we will look at that probably later. I don't know how much deeper you want to go into some of these things. We can go into more detail if you want. But from the list, it should be obvious that we have gone from a world that for almost 2,000, almost 1,200, 1,600, 1,700 years was pretty much stable. And then you have it moving to all these events happening, one right after the other on top of each other. And so that kind of indicates that something is happening. This struggle between the two opposing powers in the world, God and evil. And by the way, there's two opposing powers in evil too. And we'll talk about that more later. So let's look at some of the recent events and evidences of this struggle between the forces of apostasy and the forces of atheism. Apostasy meaning a false religion, and atheism meaning no religion at all. Okay? Let's start with the Vietnam War. You say, well, what does this have to do with anything? Essentially, the Vietnam War began as a struggle between Catholicism and communism, and the French were involved in it. The French finally had to bail out, and the United States, I say the United Nations, but the United States was persuaded to pick up the pieces. And even after France bailed, there were still issues with a Catholic leader of Vietnam. And so we find that that war is maybe not just exactly as described sometimes. And each of these powers determined to destroy one another. And by the way, they both have the same father, don't they? And then we have the fall of the Berlin Wall. Again, a struggle between atheism and apostate religion. The change of government in Poland, if you remember everything that went on there. If you read and understand about this, the United States and the papacy were working hand in hand to overthrow Poland. You know what one of the greatest weapons they sent over there was? Copy machines and paper. And they did send arms too, but that was one of the first things they sent. So the printed word does have an effect. The fall of the Soviet communism was a result of the struggle between atheistic communism and Rome, as much as it was the United States and communism. And we find that the Pope and Ronald Reagan worked together on that. And then we see it in our nation today. As you look back at the events in our nations, how many issues that we are faced with are essentially a struggle between apostate faith and atheism. Think about it. And I'm going to show you a picture at the risk of offending some of you for now. Each of the groups had their battle cry. Nominal Christianity has taken the anti-abortion or right-to-life movement as its rallying cry. And by the way, we see that in this picture. And forget the girl there, but look at the people around her. What do you see? Clerical collars, along with the political suits. So atheism countered with this cry, freedom to choose, égalitaire, libertad, which were cries of the French Revolution. And lest you wonder, I'm dead set against abortion, but I can't take out the whole package that comes along with that stance. Now atheism has taken on a new cry. Save Mother Earth. Now I'm for taking care of our planet. I believe we should. I believe it is our duty. But to do it as worship to Mother Earth is the basis and most primal kind of paganism. And it's an interesting situation statistically that those who push for the law, so forth, to save planet Earth are the most likely to be doing the things to harm it. Like multiple groups of people taking private jets to fly to a conference to save the world. So the public is whipsawed back and forth with fine words and clever lies, but it is still just the king of the north fighting the king of the south, and the plan is to bring anarchy. And who's caught in the middle? God's people are always caught in the middle. Now there's another factor, and I go back and forth about how I feel about this. Some say it's a non-factor, but with the parallels that are happening now, it's enlightening. We see the reawakening of Islam as a world force. And a lot of people don't understand how much now it is influencing the United States government. And I won't go into that whole thing, but there's a tremendous Islamic influence in the United States government. And we have Islam awakening around the world. I believe the Bible refers to that. And I don't believe that the two views are incompatible. I believe they're complementary. In fact, there's a prophecy in Revelation 3 that refers to the three phases of Islamic power, which, like I say, we'll have to deal with that at another time. Revelation 9 presents a cryptic prophecy that many see as referring to Islam. So read that and we'll talk about it later. So, this is the condition of the world when we enter Daniel 12. It says, at that time Michael shall stand up. It's strange that deliverance brings trouble. If we look at the tenor of the time since the French Revolution, we find a statement that pretty much sums up a condition that has been steadily growing since that time. And I want to share with you a quote here from a lady named Ellen White. It says, rebellion and apostasy are in the very air we breathe. We shall be affected by them unless we by faith hang our helpless souls upon Christ. If men are so easily misled now, how will they stand when Satan shall personate Christ and work miracles? Who will be unmoved by his misrepresentations then, professing to be Christ when it is only Satan assuming the person of Christ and apparently working the good works of Christ? What will hold God's people from giving their allegiance to false Christ? Go not after them, is what Jesus said. So along with the infighting of these two evil powers, which proceed with their agendas out in the open, we have open and violent struggle between Islam and apostate Christianity, which I believe is essentially part of the same battle. And all this people more and more deciding to do what they want, regardless, without any clue of what's really happening. But God's people will be faithful. And this is the condition of the world when we enter Daniel 12. At that time, Michael shall stand up. While the two evil powers in the world are whipsawing the population of the planet, bringing disaster and destruction upon them, using them to accomplish their purposes, Michael will stand up. When you can't join with movements that seem to be good because they have an underlying agenda against God, Michael will stand up. When it seems like the whole world is falling apart, Michael will stand up. His people will carry such a strong message, such a powerful message, that the forces of evil will for a time combine to do away with the troublemakers. And then comes deliverance. Those who are faithful, those who have their names on God's record, will be delivered. Those who have rejected the king of the south and the king of the north will be delivered. Those who have more than anything else looked forward to that event, who have been faithful in their worship, who have stood fiery trials, who have called to stand among the heathen for right and given up their apostasy, will be delivered. Those who by teaching and example have led others to salvation will be delivered. And they will be there in the kingdom made new along with Daniel the prophet. Because in Daniel 12:13, we read this to the faithful prophet, but go your way until the end, for you shall rest, and you will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days. Now we have a little more time before we get to that point. Events are moving more rapidly than they did at the beginning of time. They're moving more rapidly than they did at the beginning of the end of time in 1844. The question that each of us needs to ask ourselves is, are we ready for Michael to stand up? Are we covered with the blood of Jesus? Are our names in the Lamb's Book of Life? When he stands up, will we be standing with him or against him? And that is a life and death question to which we must give an answer. Okay, it's time for our study again. So let's get our next study guides and spend some time with this topic.